Don't talk about your job. My mother mocked me at dinner to please my sister's fiancé, but at the wedding, the national TV turned on the cameras. This cathedral was restored by the woman they were searching for. My shamed mother fled. Welcome to Vance Rock Stories. Have you ever walked into a room where everyone had already decided who you were before you even said a word? Maybe you've been treated like the family disappointment while someone else got all the praise. If you've ever lived through something like that, let me know where you're watching from and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional family drama with unexpected twists, don't forget to subscribe. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Lena Carter. I'm 35 years old, and according to my mother, I'm still trying to find my direction. That's the version of me my family has repeated for years. Not the real one. The night everything started was supposed to be about my younger sister, Ava. She wanted us all to meet her fiancé for the first time, so Mom insisted on hosting dinner at her house. She treated it like a formal event. The expensive china came out. The dining table was decorated like Thanksgiving had arrived 3 months early. Even Dad wore a jacket, which only happened for weddings, funerals, and whenever Mom thought someone important might judge us. I drove over straight from work. I'd barely had enough time to change clothes before leaving, and I remember checking my sleeves twice in the car just to make sure I didn't bring dust home with me. The moment I stepped inside, Mom looked me up and down. "There you are," she said, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Try not to disappear before dessert." I wasn't planning to. She nodded, but something about her expression felt rehearsed, almost nervous. Inside, everyone was already seated except me. Dad gave me a small smile. Ava looked beautiful, glowing with the kind of happiness that made people stare. Beside her sat Elliot, tall, relaxed, well-dressed without trying too hard. He stood up the second I walked over. "You must be Lena," he said, offering his hand. "I've heard a lot about you." For some reason, that sentence made the room unusually quiet. I noticed Mom glance toward Ava. Ava quickly picked up her glass. Dad suddenly became very interested in cutting his roast. It was strange. I couldn't explain it, but everyone acted like they were waiting for something to go wrong. Dinner started normally enough. Elliot asked Dad about his vegetable garden. He complimented Ava's cooking. He even laughed at one of my uncle's terrible jokes. The conversation flowed around the table, just never toward me. Whenever I looked up, someone would smoothly change the subject before I could join in. It wasn't obvious, not enough for a stranger to notice. But when you've spent your whole life in the same family, you recognize the pattern. I was being managed. Again. Mom had always been good at it. If relatives asked how I was doing, she'd answer before I opened my mouth. If neighbors asked about my career, she'd smile politely and say, "Lena's still figuring things out." Eventually, people stopped asking me directly. It made life easier for everyone, except me. I reached for the bread basket when I caught Ava giving Mom another quick look. Mom answered with the smallest shake of her head. It happened so fast most people would have missed it. I didn't. They were communicating without words. About me. The realization settled quietly in my stomach. Whatever conversation had happened before I arrived, I had been part of it, just not invited. A few minutes later, Elliot turned toward me for the first time since dinner started. Unlike everyone else, he actually faced me completely. "So, Lena." His voice was easygoing, curious, not polite curiosity, real curiosity. "What do you do?" The table went completely still. Mom's fork stopped halfway to her plate. Dad looked down. Ava pressed her lips together. For the first time all evening, every single person at that table was looking directly at me. "What do you do?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Before I could answer, my mother set her fork down with a quiet little tap. "Oh, sweetheart," she said with a light laugh. Let's not bore everyone with work talk tonight. A few people chuckled. Ava smiled into her wine glass. Even my aunt added, "We're celebrating. Let's keep things fun." I looked at Elliot. He hadn't laughed. He was still waiting for my answer like he'd asked a perfectly normal question. "It's okay," he said. I asked. Mom waved her hand. "Lena's been exploring different paths for years." "I didn't ask that," Elliot replied politely. "I asked what she does." Nobody spoke. I could feel every pair of eyes drifting back to me. This wasn't new. Growing up, Mom had always answered questions for me. Teachers, neighbors, church friends. Eventually, I stopped correcting her because it never changed anything. Tonight almost felt easier. Almost. I took a sip of water before answering. I restore historic stained glass. The silence lasted about half a second. Then my cousin laughed. "I'm sorry," he said. "Like, church windows?" Someone else smiled. "So people actually pay for that?" Ava leaned back in her chair. I told you she'd say something random. Mom gave her a look that was supposed to be subtle. It wasn't. She smiled at Elliot. "Lena has always been creative. She likes old buildings and little art projects." "Mom." "What?" "You asked." "No," she corrected softly. "He asked." Another round of quiet laughter circled the table. It wasn't cruel. That almost made it worse. It sounded familiar, like everyone already knew which part they were supposed to play. I kept my eyes on my plate. Normally, I'd let the conversation move on. That had become my specialty. Smile. Stay quiet. Finish dinner. Drive home. But Elliot still hadn't moved. He looked at me instead of everyone else. "What kind of stained glass?" he asked. "Churches? Cathedrals? Historic buildings? Memorial chapels? Sometimes museums?" His eyebrows lifted. "So, conservation work?" I nodded. "Mostly restoration." "What studio?" "My own." That finally caught Ava off guard. "You have your own business?" I looked at her. "You've never asked." She blinked, then looked away first. Mom jumped in before the silence settled. "It's a tiny workshop," she said quickly. "Very niche." Elliot ignored the interruption. "What's it called?" "Carter Glass Conservation." He repeated the name quietly. "Carter Glass?" Something changed in his expression. Not recognition. More like he was trying to remember where he'd heard it before. "You okay?" Ava asked him. "Yeah." He frowned slightly. "I've definitely heard that name." Mom laughed. "You probably saw it on one of those local craft fairs." "I don't think so." He rested his fork beside his plate. "I know it from somewhere." Nobody said anything. For the first time all evening, the conversation wasn't being controlled by my mother. Elliot was thinking. Really thinking. He looked directly at me. "Your studio wouldn't happen to be on Willow Street, would it?" My head lifted. "It is." He blinked. "No way." Ava frowned. "What?" Elliot didn't answer her. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His thumb moved quickly across the screen. He scrolled through several photos before stopping on one. Then he looked back at me. "Can you tell me if you've ever worked on this?" I leaned forward to look at the screen. The moment I saw the photo, I recognized it. A stained glass rose window. Deep sapphire blues around the border. Crimson accents through the center. One tiny repair near the lower right panel that almost nobody ever noticed. Except me. "I know it," I said quietly. Elliot looked up. "You've seen it?" I restored it. His eyes widened. "You did?" I nodded. "About 2 years ago." He zoomed in on the photo and pointed toward the corner. "There was a cracked panel here." "There were 3, I corrected. One had been replaced in the 70s with modern glass. I removed it and rebuilt the section using mouth-blown restoration glass." Nobody else at the table seemed to understand what I was talking about. Elliot did. He stared at me for another second before looking back at his phone. I knew it. What? Ava asked. He looked almost embarrassed. My family owns the foundation that funded that restoration. The room went silent again. Mom gave a polite laugh. What a small world. No, Elliot said slowly. I don't think this is a small world. He tapped the screen again. My mother has this photo because our foundation uses it during presentations. He looked directly at me. The conservator's name was Carter Glass Conservation. I nodded once. That's my studio. Dad finally looked up from his plate. You've worked on projects like that? A few. A few? My cousin repeated. I shrugged. They keep me busy. Mom cleared her throat. Lena tends to exaggerate sometimes. I turned toward her. I don't. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Elliot broke the silence instead. My mom has been trying to find this conservator for over a year. I frowned. Find me? Yeah. He unlocked another folder on his phone. There were pictures of churches, old libraries, stained glass domes, restoration reports. This isn't just one project. He kept scrolling. Our foundation is restoring Ashcroft Cathedral. Just hearing the name made me pause. Everyone in the county knew Ashcroft Cathedral. It wasn't just historic. It was one of the most recognizable buildings in the state. The lead conservator retired, Elliot continued. The selection committee recommended one studio over everyone else. He looked at me again. Yours. I honestly thought he had the wrong person. I never submitted a proposal. That's the strange part. He frowned. My mother said your studio never replied. I never received anything. He looked genuinely confused. We mailed letters. I didn't get them. We sent emails. I never saw those either. For the first time that evening, Elliot wasn't looking at me like Ava's older sister. He was looking at me like someone trying to solve a puzzle. Mom reached for her wine. I'm sure there was just some misunderstanding. Maybe, Elliot said, but we've been searching for Carter Glass Conservation for almost 14 months. He laughed once, mostly at himself. And somehow I meet the owner at Sunday dinner. Nobody laughed with him. The room felt different now. Not warmer, just uncertain. Ava kept looking between us. I didn't even know you worked on churches. I smiled a little. You never asked. She looked away. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. I guess none of us did. Even Mom stayed quiet. That might have been the strangest part of the night. She always had something to say. Elliot locked his phone and rested both hands on the table. If you don't mind me asking, I nodded. Would you be willing to meet my mother? Your mother? She chairs the Whitmore Heritage Foundation. He smiled politely. I have a feeling she'd want to meet you as soon as possible. The entire table turned to look at me again. This time, nobody was laughing. Mom didn't wait until everyone left. The second Ava and Elliot stepped outside to show Dad the engagement photos in Elliot's car, Mom picked up a stack of dessert plates and looked straight at me. Lena, kitchen. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. I'd known that tone since I was a teenager. I followed her without saying anything. The moment the kitchen door swung shut behind us, she placed a plate in the sink a little harder than necessary. What was that? She asked. I blinked. What was what? You know exactly what. I answered a question. You changed the entire mood of the evening. I folded my arms. I didn't bring up my job. Elliot did. You could have kept it simple. I did. She turned on the faucet even though there wasn't anything to rinse. I told you tonight wasn't about you. I know. Then why couldn't you let your sister have one peaceful dinner? I stared at her for a second. I don't understand. She finally looked at me. The Whitmores are different. What does that mean? They notice everything. I almost laughed. So? So first impressions matter? I shook my head. I still don't see the problem. Mom sighed like I was making something obvious difficult. Elliot comes from a very respected family. They have connections everywhere. Business leaders, museum boards, donors, and I didn't want them getting the wrong impression. The wrong impression of who? Our family. There it was. Not me. Us. At least that's how she saw it. I restore stained glass, I said quietly. I'm not hiding bodies. You work on construction sites. Historic restoration sites. You climb scaffolding. Sometimes. You come home covered in dust. Because that's the job. She pointed toward the dining room. And what do you think his family sees? I didn't answer, because I genuinely didn't know. Mom did. They'll see my older daughter climbing around in work boots while their son marries your sister in a designer suit. I stared at her. You've thought about this. For months. So that's why nobody wanted me talking. She didn't deny it. Instead, she dried her hands carefully with a towel. I simply wanted tonight to go smoothly. I leaned against the counter. You told Elliot things about me before I even got here, didn't you? She hesitated. Only for a second. I told him not to ask too many personal questions. Why? I didn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. Who? You? No. I shook my head. You meant you. She looked away. For the first time all evening, neither of us had another sentence ready. The silence wasn't angry. It was tired. Eventually, she picked up another plate. I love you, Lena. I know. I just want people to understand our family. I looked at her for a long moment. I wish you wanted them to understand me. She didn't answer. The conversation ended the way most of ours did. Not resolved. Just finished. I grabbed my coat from the hallway and said goodbye to Dad. Ava hugged me before I left. She looked distracted. Sorry dinner got weird. It wasn't your fault. She smiled a little. I think Elliot likes you. I think Elliot likes old buildings. She laughed for the first time all night. Maybe. The drive back to my studio was quiet. The workshop sat above an old brick storefront I'd inherited from my mentor years ago. It wasn't fancy, but every tool inside had earned its place. I unlocked the front door, tossed my keys onto the workbench, and noticed an envelope resting against the lamp. Heavy cream-colored paper. No stamp. Someone had delivered it by hand. Across the front, in elegant lettering, was my name. Ms. Lena Carter. In the upper corner was a gold-embossed seal, Whitmore Heritage Foundation. I stood there for a moment before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a formal letter. They were requesting a private meeting to discuss the restoration of Ashcroft Cathedral. Lena followed the address on the invitation until the streets grew quieter. The Ashcroft Heritage Foundation occupied a beautifully restored stone building that looked more like a museum than an office. I sat in my car for a minute, staring at the envelope before forcing myself to get out. I almost drove away. Not because I didn't want the opportunity, because my mother's words from dinner kept replaying in my head. Don't embarrass us. A receptionist greeted me with a warm smile. Ms. Carter, we've been expecting you. That simple sentence caught me off guard. Most people barely remembered my name. She led me through a hallway lined with photographs of historic restoration projects, churches, libraries, courthouses. I slowed down to admire every image. You noticed the details? I turned and saw Elliot walking toward me. I figured you would, he said with a smile. I couldn't help it. My grandfather always does the same thing. For the first time since dinner, I smiled back. Inside the conference room, Elliot introduced me to architects, historians, and conservation specialists. Nobody asked how much money I made or whether my business was successful. They asked about restoration methods, historical glass, pigments, and preservation techniques. For once, I wasn't defending my career. I was simply talking about the work I loved. One of the senior conservators looked impressed. You still sketch every panel before removing it? I do. Most restorers rely entirely on software now. I trust my own eyes first. He nodded with approval. So do I. That small exchange settled my nerves. Then the chairman uncovered a massive blueprint. This is Ashcroft Cathedral. The stained glass dome dominated the drawing. Even on paper, it was breathtaking. It's beautiful, I said quietly. It is, he replied. But it's deteriorating much faster than expected. He spread several photographs across the table. Cracked lead lines, missing glass, poor repairs from decades earlier, water damage around the edges. We've spoken with several restoration firms, he explained. Most recommend replacing large sections. I shook my head almost immediately. You disagree? I'd preserve every original piece that can still be saved. The room fell silent for a second before a few specialists exchanged approving looks. For nearly an hour, we discussed different restoration approaches. Every question became more technical, and without realizing it, I forgot how nervous I'd been. This was where I belonged. Finally, the chairman folded his hands. If you accept this project, Ms. Carter, it will be the largest restoration commission our foundation has awarded in over 20 years. I took a slow breath. The responsibility was enormous. I'll need to review everything carefully. He smiled. That's exactly the answer we hoped to hear. As the meeting ended, Elliot walked me outside. You handled yourself well. I honestly thought I was going to panic before walking in. You hit it. I've had a lot of practice. He laughed, then hesitated before opening my car door. Oh, there's something I forgot to mention. What is it? The cathedral will be closed for restoration while you work. That makes sense. But when it's finished... He rubbed the back of his neck. It's hosting the biggest event in my family's calendar. I frowned. What event? He gave me an awkward smile. My wedding. I stared at him. My wedding to Vanessa. I just stared at Elliot for a second. Everything suddenly made sense. The awkward looks at dinner. My mother's desperate attempts to stop me from talking about my job. The way she kept changing the subject every time Elliot asked me a question. She wasn't embarrassed by me. She was terrified that his family would discover who I really was. Elliot frowned. Are you okay? I just remembered something. I forced a smile that probably looked more convincing than I felt. I'm fine. He didn't push. If you have questions about the project, call me anytime. I will. The drive home felt much longer than it should have. Instead of thinking about the cathedral, I kept replaying dinner in my head. My mother hadn't been worried about an awkward conversation. She had been trying to prevent this exact situation. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, her car was already there. She must have been waiting. The front door opened before I even reached the porch. So? She asked. You went. I did. She crossed her arms. What did they want? They offered me the restoration project. For a brief moment, she didn't say anything. Then she let out a slow breath and looked away. I was afraid of that. You knew? I had a feeling after Elliot recognized your name. I blinked. You knew this could happen and you still wanted me to stay quiet? She lowered her voice. Lena, please. Just listen. We stepped inside and she closed the door behind us. The Ashcroft family cares about reputation. They have business partners, donors, people from all over the country watching everything they do. I don't see what that has to do with me. It has everything to do with you. She looked exhausted. If you're leading the restoration, you'll be at the cathedral almost every day. Yes. People will see you. I know. Elliot's family will see you. I frowned. So? She hesitated before finally saying what she'd clearly been trying to avoid. They'll wonder why Vanessa's older sister works on construction sites. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's not a construction site. It's a historic restoration. You know that. I know that. But people don't always understand. They're hiring me because I specialize in this. She rubbed her forehead. That doesn't matter. It should. Lena. Her voice softened. I don't want Vanessa's future in-laws thinking our family couldn't produce anything more respectable. The words landed harder than she probably intended. I stared at her. So you'd rather they think I barely have a career? She didn't answer. That silence was answer enough. I've spent 15 years building this business, I said quietly. I know. No, I don't think you do. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back. I'm asking you to think about your sister. I have been thinking about her. Then decline the project. I almost laughed because the request sounded so impossible. This is the biggest opportunity of my career. I know. It may never happen again. I know. But sometimes family comes first. I looked at her for a long moment. Family. That word always seemed to mean sacrificing something when it came to me. Never anyone else. She searched my face, waiting for an answer. Finally, I took a slow breath. I can't answer today. Lena, I need time. She nodded, though I could tell it wasn't the answer she wanted. Just think carefully before you decide. I will. That night, I placed the foundation's contract on my kitchen table. Beside it sat my mother's words. For a long time, I simply looked back and forth between them. One represented everything I had worked for. The other represented the family I had spent my whole life trying not to disappoint. I reached for the contract, then stopped, deciding I needed one more day before making my choice. The quiet inside my studio felt completely different from the silence in my apartment. Here, every unfinished panel, every sheet of colored glass, every workbench reminded me why I had chosen this career in the first place. I placed the foundation's contract on my desk and left it unopened. Instead of reading it again, I picked up the small restoration project I'd been working on all week. It belonged to a neighborhood church. Nothing famous, nothing expensive. Just a century-old stained glass window that deserved another chance. I put on my gloves and got to work. Whenever my mind became too noisy, my hands usually knew what to do. Piece by piece, I cleaned the fractured glass. Slowly, my breathing settled. My phone buzzed. Vanessa. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but I answered. Hey. You talked to Mom? I did. A short silence followed. I'm sorry dinner turned into such a mess. It wasn't your fault. I know she can be intense. I smiled a little. That's one way to describe it. Vanessa laughed softly before her voice became more serious. She just wants everything to go perfectly. I know. I hope you're not angry. I'm not angry with you. That seemed to relieve her. We talked for another minute about normal things. The florist she'd chosen, the honeymoon she and Elliot were planning, how overwhelmed she felt trying to organize a wedding. Neither of us mentioned the project. When the call ended, I realized something. Vanessa wasn't asking me to give up my career. That had been Mom. I looked around my studio again. Every tool on those shelves had a story. Some had belonged to my mentor, Arthur Bennett. He'd taken a chance on me when almost nobody else did. I walked over to an old wooden cabinet and opened the top drawer. Inside was a faded photograph of the two of us standing beneath another restored cathedral window years ago. Arthur had smiled the way he always did. Proud, patient. I still remembered something he told me during my first year as his apprentice. The greatest restoration job you'll ever see probably won't come looking twice. Back then, I'd laughed. He hadn't. He explained that landmark projects only appeared once in a generation, and every conservator dreamed of being trusted with one. Years later, when Arthur became too sick to keep working, we sat in the same studio talking about unfinished goals. He admitted there was one cathedral he had always hoped to restore, Ashcroft Cathedral. "They'll never call me now," he'd said with a small smile. "Maybe they'll call you someday." At the time, it sounded impossible. Now his words echoed through the empty studio. I looked back at the contract lying on my desk. This wasn't just another commission. It was the opportunity my mentor had spent his entire career hoping for. Turning it down wouldn't simply protect someone's image. It would erase everything Arthur had believed I could become. I pulled out my chair and opened the contract one last time. The terms were fair. The timeline was demanding. The responsibility was enormous. I picked up the pen. For a second, my hand stopped. I thought about my mother's face, Vanessa's wedding, everything that could become complicated. Then I thought about Arthur, about 15 years of work, about every morning I'd unlocked this studio before sunrise because I loved what I did. Some decisions don't get easier by waiting. They only become heavier. I lowered the pen to the paper. My signature flowed across the final page. When I finished, I closed the folder and let out a slow breath. The contract was officially signed. The first morning at Ashcroft Cathedral felt surreal. Workers were already unloading equipment when I arrived. Scaffolding surrounded the stained glass dome, and sunlight poured through the damaged panels, scattering faded colors across the stone floor. One of the project managers walked over. "Good morning, Ms. Carter. We're glad you're here." He handed me a hard hat and introduced me to the restoration crew, structural engineers, photographers, and conservation specialists. Everyone had a different responsibility, but before any work started, they all turned toward me. The project manager smiled. "She's leading the glass restoration. Any work involving the dome goes through her first." I wasn't used to hearing someone introduce me like that. No one questioned my age. No one wondered if I was qualified. They simply trusted that I knew what I was doing. We spent the morning documenting every damaged section before touching a single piece of glass. One technician pointed toward a cracked panel. "Would you replace this?" I climbed onto the platform and examined it closely. "No." He looked surprised. "It still has enough original material. We can stabilize it." He nodded and immediately wrote down my recommendation. Nobody argued. Nobody rolled their eyes. They just listened. As the hours passed, conversations became easier. An architect asked where I'd trained. A conservator wanted to hear about some of my earlier church restorations. Even during lunch, people kept asking questions, not to challenge me, but because they were genuinely interested. Elliot stopped by briefly to check on the project. "How's your first day?" "Busy." He laughed. "I'll take that as a good sign." "It is." He looked around at the crew. "They already seem comfortable with you." "I wasn't expecting that." "You earned it." Those 3 words stayed with me long after he left. By the afternoon, we carefully removed the first damaged glass panel. Everyone watched while I inspected the century-old lead came supporting it. I explained what I was seeing and why certain pieces had to remain untouched. The younger conservators gathered closer, taking notes. One of them smiled. "I've read about this technique, but I've never actually seen it done." "Most people don't get the chance," I replied. "If you're interested, I'll explain each step as we go." His face lit up. "I'd really appreciate that." For the rest of the afternoon, several members of the team followed my process, asking thoughtful questions. Instead of feeling like an outsider, I finally felt like I belonged. As we packed up for the day, an elderly woman slowly entered the cathedral with a walking cane. She greeted several foundation staff by name before stopping near our work area. She watched me for a moment. Then she looked at the project manager. "Excuse me." She pointed gently in my direction. "Did you say her name is Lena Carter?" "Yes," he replied. The woman's eyes widened slightly. She took another careful step toward me. Lena. Her voice was quiet but certain. I believe I've been trying to find you for years. The entire crew went quiet. I looked at the elderly woman, certain she had mistaken me for someone else. I'm sorry, I said politely. Have we met before? She smiled. No, that's exactly the problem. She introduced herself as Margaret Holloway, one of the Foundation's longtime trustees. Even though she had officially retired, she still visited major restoration projects whenever she could. I've known your work for years, she said. I blinked. My work? She nodded. The chapel in Brookhaven, the courthouse skylight in Mercer County, St. Gabriel's East Window. I stared at her. Those weren't my biggest projects, but they weren't public either. Most people outside the restoration field had never heard of them. You've seen those? I've recommended them. The project manager smiled. Margaret has one of the best memories in the preservation community. She laughed softly. My grandchildren disagree. Everyone chuckled and the atmosphere relaxed. Then she looked back at me. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you keep declining every invitation we sent? I frowned. What invitations? The seminars, the conservation conferences, the restoration exhibitions. I shook my head. I never received any invitations. Her smile slowly disappeared. None? No. Margaret glanced at Elliot, then back at me. That can't be right. She folded her arms, thinking for a moment. For at least 4 years, different organizations have tried to contact you. I think you're confusing me with another conservator. I'm not. She spoke with complete confidence. I remember your name because you were one of the few independent restorers producing work at that level. I felt my stomach tighten. I've never turned down a professional invitation. According to our records, you did. How? You either declined them or never responded. I stood there trying to process what she had said. That made no sense. My studio phone had barely rung during those years. My inbox certainly hadn't been full of invitations. I would have accepted, I said quietly. I know. Margaret's answer came so quickly that it caught me off guard. I always thought it was strange. Every recommendation praised your work, yet every invitation came back with a polite refusal. Elliot looked just as confused. You never mentioned this before. I assumed she simply preferred working alone. I rubbed my forehead. No. I whispered more to myself than anyone else. I would have remembered. Margaret studied my expression for another second before opening her handbag. I may have something that could help. She pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages filled with handwritten notes. I keep records of projects and correspondence. Old habit. She found the page she wanted. There it is. She looked back at me. I also save copies of important emails. My heartbeat quickened. Copies? She nodded. Some of the earliest ones are archived. I swallowed. Would it be possible for me to see them? Margaret smiled gently. I was hoping you'd ask. She carefully closed the notebook. I'll send you every email we still have. Then she paused. You may finally find out why none of them ever reached you. Lena handed the copied emails back for a second because my hands had started shaking. I'll give you as much time as you need, Mrs. Whitmore said softly. I only brought them because I thought you'd want answers. I do, I whispered. She left me alone in one of the cathedral's meeting rooms while the rest of the crew continued working outside. The stained glass above me scattered patches of blue and gold across the old wooden table. I stared at the stack of printed emails again before taking a slow breath. The first message was from nearly 6 years earlier. We'd be honored to invite Ms. Lena Carter to speak at the National Heritage Conservation Conference. Below it was another message. We never received a response. We're following up one last time. Then the final reply. Thank you for your invitation. Lena Carter is no longer accepting restoration projects or public appearances. Please remove her from future contact lists. My stomach tightened. I had never seen that email before. I turned to the next page. Another museum. Another restoration society. Another international workshop. Different organizations. Different years. Exactly the same outcome. Every invitation ended with someone politely declining on my behalf. At first, I thought maybe there had been some mistake with my old business email, but then I noticed something that made my heart pound. Every reply came from the same contact, not my studio, not my personal email, a residential internet address. I frowned and looked closer. That address felt familiar. Too familiar. I pulled out my phone and searched through old contacts I'd never bothered deleting. My finger stopped. The email domain matched the one my parents had used for years. No. I zoomed in again, hoping I had misread it. I hadn't. Someone had been answering professional invitations from my parents' house. I sat back in my chair, trying to make sense of it. Maybe my mother had only responded once because she'd opened a letter by accident. But there weren't one or two emails. There were dozens. They stretched across years, each one politely turning down opportunities I never even knew existed. A conference in Boston, an exhibition in Chicago, a fellowship in Europe, a television interview about historical restoration, even an invitation to collaborate with a famous cathedral conservator whose books had been sitting on my shelf since I was 24. I never ignored those people. I never rejected them. I never even knew they existed. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Elliot stepped inside. "I heard you were taking a break," he said carefully. "Everything okay?" I looked up and gave a humorless laugh. "I don't think I know what okay means anymore." He noticed the papers immediately. Mrs. Whitmore must have told him. He sat across from me without touching the documents. "I remember some of these," he admitted. "Our foundation reached out more than once before we finally found your studio." "You thought I was refusing?" "We assumed you weren't interested." I shook my head. I've spent years wondering why my career never seemed to move forward while everyone else kept getting invited back. He stayed quiet. "I thought maybe I just wasn't good enough." "You really had no idea?" "None." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Elliot said, "The person writing these emails knew exactly how to sound professional. Nobody had any reason to question them." That sentence hit harder than everything else. This wasn't random. It wasn't careless. Whoever did it understood enough to make every rejection believable. I picked up another page. The signature at the bottom was simple. "Kind regards." No name. No explanation. Just enough to close every door before I ever saw it. I closed my eyes for a second. Memories I had ignored for years suddenly felt different. Packages that never arrived. Letters my mother said looked like junk mail. Phone calls she claimed were wrong numbers. Times she'd casually told me, "Nobody's looking for stained glass artists these days." I had believed her. Every single time. When I finally looked back down at the papers, I wasn't searching for more evidence anymore. I was trying to accept what was already in front of me. The address at the bottom of every email wasn't a coincidence. It led to only one place: my parents' house. And for the first time, I found myself asking a question I never thought I'd have to ask. Who inside that house had been speaking for me all these years? The question stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. I couldn't concentrate the way I usually did. Every glass panel I cleaned reminded me of another email I had never seen. Every careful movement of my hands was interrupted by another memory that suddenly didn't make sense anymore. When the crew broke for lunch, I stepped outside and sat on one of the cathedral's stone benches. Instead of calling my parents, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my former mentor's assistant, Grace. She answered after a couple of rings. "Lena?" "Wow, it's been forever." "It has." We spent a minute catching up before I finally asked the question that had been weighing on me. Can I ask you something strange? Of course. Years ago, did Professor Allen ever try to contact me after he retired? There was a short pause. I thought he did. No, I mean, did he actually? Lena. Her voice softened. He tried several times. My chest tightened. What do you mean? He wanted you to take over a restoration workshop he had been running. He kept saying you were the only person he trusted with it. I stared at the ground. I never heard about that. We figured you changed your mind. I didn't. Grace sounded genuinely confused. He mailed letters first. Then he called. Eventually, someone from your family started answering. My family? Yes. She hesitated. I assumed it was your mother. My fingers slowly wrapped tighter around my phone. What made you think it was her? She introduced herself that way. Everything around me seemed unusually quiet. Grace continued carefully. She was always polite. She said you were overwhelmed with work and wanted a quieter life. She thanked Professor Allen for believing in you, but said you weren't accepting anything new. I closed my eyes. He believed her? Why wouldn't he? She sounded like she was protecting your schedule. Another missing piece fell into place. After we ended the call, I immediately reached out to another contact, then another, a museum curator from Philadelphia, an organizer from a preservation conference, a restoration consultant I'd met only once years ago. The answers were painfully consistent. Oh, we spoke with your mother. She handled your correspondence. She told us you wanted privacy. We assumed she represented you. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? Families helped manage businesses all the time. No one imagined they were quietly closing doors instead. By the time I put my phone away, I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the loud, explosive way I expected. I just felt hollow. I kept thinking about how many nights I'd stayed late in my studio wondering why my career seemed frozen. I blamed the economy. I blamed timing. Sometimes I blamed myself. I took smaller commissions because I thought bigger institutions simply weren't interested. I worked twice as hard trying to prove I deserved opportunities that had already been offered and taken away before I ever knew they existed. The loss wasn't only financial. It was years of experience, people I could have learned from, students I might have taught, friendships I never had the chance to build. I couldn't get those years back. Lena? Elliot's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. The afternoon work session was about to begin. You okay? I looked at the cathedral rising above us. For a long moment, I didn't answer. Finally, I folded every copied email, placed them neatly inside my bag, and stood up. I don't think today is the day to confront anyone. He nodded without trying to change my mind. You have every right to. I know. But if I go home angry right now, I let out a slow breath. I'll stop thinking like a conservator and start thinking like a daughter. And today? I looked up at the unfinished stained glass dome waiting above the scaffolding. Today, someone trusted me with a cathedral that survived more than a century. I adjusted my work gloves. I'm not letting anyone take this away from me, too. Without another word, I walked back toward the scaffolding. The questions about my family could wait a little longer. The cathedral couldn't. And for the first time in years, I chose my work before I chose their approval. The days settled into a rhythm that finally felt familiar again. I climbed the scaffolding before most people arrived, coffee in one hand and my tool case in the other. By the time the morning sunlight filtered through the upper windows, I was already inspecting cracked lead lines or documenting another section of glass that had survived more than a century. For the first time in weeks, my mind wasn't consumed by unanswered questions. The emails were still sitting inside my desk drawer at the studio. I hadn't forgotten them. I had simply decided they didn't deserve every hour of my day. There was too much work waiting for me here. The restoration team had started trusting my judgment completely. Whenever an unexpected problem came up, they looked to me before making a decision. Lena, should we replace this support? No, I'd answer, examining the frame. We reinforce it first. If we replace too much, we lose part of its history. Nobody argued, not because I demanded authority, but because they respected experience. It was a feeling I wasn't used to. At home, every opinion I offered seemed to invite criticism. Here, people listened. Even Elliot stopped introducing me as Vanessa's sister. Now he simply said, "Our lead conservator thinks this section should stay original." It was a small change, but somehow it meant everything. One afternoon, the Foundation's director joined us for a site inspection. He slowly walked beneath the restored sections, looking up for several quiet moments. Finally, he smiled. "I've visited this cathedral for almost 40 years, he said. "I don't remember the glass looking this alive." I laughed. "It always looked like this. We just removed everything hiding it." He nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose people can be like that too." His comment stayed with me longer than I expected. During lunch breaks, the workers talked about ordinary things: their kids, baseball, weekend fishing trips, restaurant recommendations. For once, I wasn't waiting for someone to make a joke about my career. I wasn't trying to explain why restoring stained glass mattered. I could simply exist. It was surprisingly peaceful. A few weeks later, new activity began inside the cathedral. Event planners arrived carrying floor plans. Florists measured the aisles. Lighting technicians discussed camera positions. I watched from the scaffolding as people walked through the nave, pointing at different locations. One of the project coordinators noticed me looking. "They're starting wedding preparations." I smiled politely. I figured. "It's going to be one of the biggest private ceremonies this cathedral has hosted." "I've heard." She checked her clipboard. The Ashcroft Foundation wanted to make sure restoration and wedding planning wouldn't interfere with each other. "So we're sharing the building?" "Pretty much." As the days passed, the cathedral slowly transformed. Fresh flowers appeared near the entrance. Musicians tested the acoustics. Decorators measured every corner with incredible precision. Meanwhile, my crew continued restoring the final sections high above them. It created a strange contrast. Below us, people planned one perfect day. Above them, we were preserving something meant to last another 100 years. One afternoon, I climbed down earlier than usual to review the latest restoration photos. As I crossed the main aisle, I stopped without realizing it. Workers were arranging sample tables exactly where guests would eventually sit. The aisle stretched toward the altar. Above it, my eyes followed the sunlight upward. The restored stained glass dome glowed with colors I hadn't seen since the project began. Blue, amber, deep crimson. Every repaired panel reflected light across the stone floor below. Wedding planners admired the decorations. Photographers discussed camera angles. None of them looked up for more than a second. But I did. Because every beam of colored light touching that floor had passed through months of my work. The celebration everyone was preparing for would happen directly beneath something I had brought back to life. I stood there quietly for another moment. Then I heard one of the coordinators speaking to a florist nearby. "Make sure the bride gets plenty of photos under the restored dome." The florist smiled. "It's going to be the most beautiful part of the entire ceremony." I looked up one more time. Neither of them knew who had restored it, and somehow that realization settled over me more heavily than I expected. The closer we got to finishing the restoration, the busier the cathedral became. Construction schedules overlapped with wedding rehearsals. My crew started earlier each morning so we could avoid getting in the way of decorators and event planners. It was an unusual arrangement, but somehow it worked. Most of the people preparing for the wedding barely looked up at the scaffolding. To them, we were simply the restoration crew. One afternoon, I climbed down to review color samples with one of the architects. As we crossed the nave, I noticed Vanessa walking through the cathedral with my mother and a wedding coordinator. They were discussing flowers and seating arrangements. Vanessa spotted me first. She smiled politely. "Oh, hi, Lena." "Hey." Before we could say anything else, my mother stepped between us. "There you are," she said with a practiced smile. She turned toward the wedding coordinator. "This is my older daughter. She's helping with the restoration team." Helping. I looked at her. Not leading, not directing, not the conservator responsible for the entire project. Just helping. The coordinator smiled warmly. "That must be interesting." "It is," I answered. Before I could say another word, my mother continued. "She's always liked arts and crafts." Arts and crafts. For a second, I wondered if I'd heard her correctly. The architect standing beside me shifted uncomfortably. He knew exactly what my role was. So did two engineers who had been discussing structural reports with me less than 5 minutes earlier. No one corrected her. Neither did I. The conversation moved on as if nothing strange had happened. Vanessa seemed distracted by wedding details and didn't notice anything unusual. The coordinator returned to discussing floral arrangements. Within seconds, I was invisible again. The architect waited until we were out of earshot. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "I've attended enough project meetings to know who's actually running this restoration." I forced a small smile. "It isn't your problem." "No." He hesitated. "But it shouldn't be yours either." His words stayed with me for the rest of the day. It wasn't just one conversation. Over the next week, it happened again. And again. Whenever my mother encountered someone connected to the wedding, she carefully described me in the smallest way possible. "Lena helps with the conservation crew. She works with stained glass. She's assisting the restoration." Every sentence was technically true. None of them told the whole story. I noticed something else too. Whenever Elliot approached, my mother's tone changed immediately. She found reasons to end conversations. She steered people away. Sometimes she physically positioned herself between us before Elliot could introduce me properly. It was subtle enough that most people never noticed, but once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. One afternoon, I caught Elliot watching the same interaction from across the cathedral. He walked over after my mother disappeared into another hallway. "Does she always do that?" "Do what?" "Answer questions that are directed at you." I gave a tired laugh. "You noticed?" "I've noticed for weeks." I shrugged. "I'm used to it." He frowned. "I don't think you should have to be." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then my radio crackled. "Lena, we need you at the North Tower." I nodded toward Elliot. "Back to work." He smiled. "See you tomorrow." That evening, I left the cathedral later than usual. The streets were almost empty by the time I reached my studio. I unlocked the front door, expecting another quiet night of organizing restoration sketches before heading home. Instead, I stopped in the doorway. The lights inside were already on. Someone was sitting in the small waiting area. My mother. She slowly stood as soon as she saw me. "We need to talk," she said. For the first time in weeks, she had come to my studio instead of asking me to come to her. My mother stood in the middle of my studio as if she had never been there before. Maybe she hadn't. She looked around at the shelves filled with restoration sketches, old stained glass fragments waiting to be repaired, and photographs from projects I'd completed over the years. "You've kept this place nice," she said. I locked the door behind me. "What are you doing here?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for one of the framed photos on the wall. It showed a church window I'd restored 3 years earlier. "You never told us your work looked like this." I almost laughed. "I tried." She set the frame back down. "I don't want to argue tonight." "Then why are you here?" She took a slow breath before opening her handbag. "I came because we need to solve a problem." She pulled out a large envelope and placed it on my work table. I didn't touch it. "What's that?" "Open it." I slid the envelope toward me and looked inside. My eyes widened. There was a cashier's check. The amount was so large that it would cover my studio's rent, equipment upgrades, and operating costs for years. I looked back at her. Where did this come from? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. It's family money. I stared at the number again. This wasn't help. This was an offer. Or maybe a purchase. My mother folded her hands together. Take it. For what? You know exactly for what. Silence settled between us. You want me to leave the cathedral. I want you to step away from the project before people start asking questions. I couldn't believe how calmly she said it. As if this is a simple scheduling conflict. It can be. No, Mom. It doesn't have to become something bigger. I slowly pushed the envelope back across the table. You came all the way here with a check. I came here with a solution. A solution for who? Her jaw tightened. For this family. I shook my head. The foundation hired me because of my work. And another conservator can finish it. They hired me to lead it. She looked away for a second before speaking again. You've already proven yourself. No. I think you have. Then why are you asking me to disappear? She didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the front window and looked out at the empty street. You don't understand how people like Elliot's family think. I frowned. Then explain it. They notice everything. So? They expect certain appearances. I let out a quiet breath. There it is. She turned back toward me. If they find out you're the person restoring the cathedral, it changes the conversation. I thought that would be a good thing. Not before the wedding. Her voice was firmer now. Vanessa deserves one day where everything is perfect. And my existence ruins that? Don't twist my words. I'm trying to understand them. She rubbed her forehead. They'll start asking why we never mentioned your career. Because you never let me. Lena. They'll ask why I wasn't introduced properly. She stayed silent. They'll ask why everyone thought I was just helping. Still nothing. I looked down at the envelope again. This isn't payment. No. It's protection. She closed her eyes briefly. You can call it whatever you want. I picked up the check one more time. It was more money than I'd ever seen in a single payment. Years ago, I would have thought an amount like this could solve every problem in my life. Now it felt strangely small, because it wasn't buying my studio. It was buying my silence. You've worked so hard, my mother said quietly. You don't have to struggle anymore. I looked around my studio, the scratched workbench, the restoration tools I'd bought one piece at a time, the sketches covering one wall. Everything here existed because I had built it myself. I wasn't struggling, I said. I was building something. She looked disappointed, almost afraid. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The envelope still rested between us on the table. She had made her offer. I hadn't given her an answer. The envelope was still sitting on my workbench the next morning. I hadn't opened it again. I hadn't deposited the check. I hadn't even moved it. Before leaving for the cathedral, I slid it into a drawer and locked it away. I needed a clear head, and carrying that conversation with me all day wasn't going to help anyone. The restoration work demanded my full attention. One mistake on a century-old stained glass panel could take weeks to correct. By late afternoon, I finally returned to my studio, exhausted but satisfied with the progress we'd made. As I unlocked the front door, I noticed someone standing across the street. My father. He wasn't looking at his phone or pretending to be somewhere else. He was simply waiting. When he saw me, he raised one hand. I hope I'm not interrupting. I smiled faintly. You've never needed an appointment. He chuckled. I suppose not. We went inside. Unlike my mother, he didn't look around the studio with curiosity. He'd actually been here once before, years ago, when I'd first rented the space. Back then, the room had been nearly empty except for one table and a few borrowed tools. "You've done well," he said quietly. "I've been busy." "I can see that." Neither of us mentioned my mother's visit. Not at first. He accepted the cup of coffee I offered and sat near the window. "I heard she came yesterday." I nodded. "So she told you?" "No." I looked up. "She didn't?" He smiled sadly. "She doesn't tell me everything." That answer somehow didn't surprise me. He wrapped both hands around the warm mug before speaking again. "She asked you to leave the cathedral?" "Yes." "And she offered you money?" "Yes." He stared into his coffee for several seconds. "I wish she hadn't done that." I leaned back in my chair. "Do you agree with her?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked a different question. "Do you know much about your mother's childhood?" "Not really." "She doesn't talk about it." "No." He nodded slowly. "There's a reason." His voice became softer. "Your mother grew up in a town where everyone knew exactly how poor her family was." I listened without interrupting. "Her clothes were hand-me-downs. She told me that once. Sometimes they didn't even fit." He smiled sadly. "She was a bright kid, but children can be cruel." I watched him carefully. "They made fun of her?" "They laughed at her shoes." He paused. "They laughed at her lunches. And eventually," he looked toward the window, "they laughed at her parents." I didn't say anything. "She told me that she spent most of high school promising herself one thing." "What?" "That no one would ever look down on her family again." The room became very quiet. "After we got married," my father continued, "she worked incredibly hard to build a different life." "I know." "Sometimes. Too hard." He let out a tired sigh. "I think somewhere along the way, protecting our family's image became more important to her than letting people be themselves." His words settled heavily between us. I thought about every conversation we'd had over the years, every correction, every interruption, every time she'd answered for me. It suddenly felt less random, not excusable, but understandable. My father looked at me carefully. "I'm not asking you to agree with what she's done." I couldn't. "I'm asking you to remember that fear makes people do foolish things." I folded my arms. "She cost me years of my career." "I know." "And she still wants me to disappear." "I know." His voice cracked slightly on those last two words. For the first time, I realized how tired he looked. Like he'd been standing between two people he loved for a very long time. He reached into his jacket and stood. "I should go." Before leaving, he rested a hand on my shoulder. "Your mother isn't fighting your success." I frowned. "Then what is she fighting?" He looked at me with quiet sadness. "The terrified little girl she used to be." He walked toward the door. I didn't stop him. Long after he'd left, I remained standing in the middle of my studio. Nothing my father said erased what had happened. The lost opportunities still hurt. The emails still existed. But for the first time, I could see that my mother's actions hadn't started with me. They had started decades earlier with wounds she had never learned how to leave behind. Lena's words stayed with me for the rest of the evening. I finally understood where my mother's fear came from. It wasn't just pride. It was years of believing that looking successful mattered more than being honest. Growing up poor had left scars she never really talked about. My father had carried that secret for decades, hoping one day she'd let it go. But understanding someone isn't the same as agreeing with them. The next afternoon, I called my mother. "We need to talk." There was a long pause before she answered. "I'll stop by your studio." She arrived almost an hour later. She was dressed as neatly as ever, carrying the same leather handbag she'd brought the last time. I noticed she held it tighter than usual. She looked around my workshop without saying much. Pieces of colored glass reflected soft light across the room. My workbench was covered with sketches, restoration notes, and tiny numbered fragments waiting to be placed back into a century-old window. She rarely looked at my work this closely. "I never realized how much equipment you have," she murmured. "I've been building this studio for 12 years. She nodded but quickly looked away. Neither of us knew how to begin. Finally, she opened her bag and placed the envelope on my desk again. I brought it back. "I thought we already talked about this." "We didn't finish." I stayed quiet. She pushed the envelope toward me. "Take it." "No. You haven't even looked inside." "I don't need to." "It could solve everything." I smiled sadly. "It only solves your problem." Her shoulders stiffened. "My problem becomes your problem if Vanessa's marriage falls apart." "It won't fall apart because I restore a cathedral." "You don't understand how people like Elliot's family think." "I've met them. They're polite in public. That's different." I folded my arms. "They hired me because of my work. They hired a conservator. They don't have to know she's my daughter." There it was, the sentence she'd been trying not to say. I looked at her for a few seconds before answering. "So that's what this is really about?" She didn't respond. "You don't want them to know I'm the one leading the restoration. I want them focused on Vanessa. They can respect both of us." "You don't know that." "No, you don't know that." Silence settled between us again. She slowly sat down on one of the stools in my studio. For the first time in a long while, she looked tired instead of angry. "When I was your age," she said quietly, "people judged me before I even opened my mouth. My clothes weren't expensive enough. My parents weren't educated enough. I promised myself my children would never go through that." I listened. "I appreciate that," I said. "I really do." She looked hopeful for a moment. Then I continued. "But hiding me isn't protecting the family anymore." Her expression changed immediately. "It's hurting it." She shook her head. "No. It already has. You think you're making some noble stand. I'm just trying to live honestly. You'll regret it. I've already spent years regretting opportunities I never even knew existed." She froze. For a second, I thought she might ask about the emails. Instead, she stood. "So you've been asking questions." "I have. You should have come to me. Would you have told me the truth?" She didn't answer. That silence told me enough. I picked up the envelope and gently placed it back into her hands. "I'm not angry anymore." She frowned, almost confused. "But I'm not accepting this." "It's not about the money." "I know. It's about asking me to disappear." Her eyes became glossy, though she blinked the tears away before they could fall. "I don't want to disappear," I continued softly. "I just want to do the work I've spent my whole life learning." She looked at me for several seconds. Then she tucked the envelope back into her purse. "I hope," she said quietly, "that one day you understand what this decision costs." She turned toward the door. Just before leaving, she stopped without looking back. "When everything falls apart." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The door closed behind her. I stood alone in my studio, staring at the colored light spreading across the floor, wondering whether she truly believed those words, or whether she was trying to convince herself. The cathedral became part of my daily rhythm. Most mornings started before sunrise. I'd unlock the restoration platform while the building was still quiet, review the day's plan with my team, and spend hours studying pieces of stained glass that had survived more than a century. Little by little, the project stopped feeling intimidating. It simply became my job. One morning, Elliot arrived with several members of his family. They weren't there for wedding planning this time. They wanted to see how the restoration was progressing. "Lena," Elliot called with a smile. "Hope we're not interrupting." "Not at all. Just stay behind the safety line." His grandmother laughed. "I think we'll listen to the expert." That word still felt strange. Expert. Not failure, not the daughter who never made it. Just someone trusted to do her work. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining how we matched replacement glass to pieces that had faded over decades. Elliot's grandfather asked thoughtful questions instead of pretending to understand. "So, every section tells you something?" he asked. "It does," I said. "You can almost see the decisions made by the original artists. The challenge is knowing which parts to preserve and which parts to repair." He nodded slowly. "You're protecting history." "I try to." He smiled. "No. You're succeeding." It was such a simple sentence, yet I couldn't remember hearing anything like that from my own family. As the tour continued, several foundation staff joined us. They already knew the project well, but they still listened while I answered questions. Nobody interrupted me, nobody laughed, nobody rushed me to change the subject. It felt normal. The foundation's chairman, Mr. Ashcroft, arrived just before lunch. He greeted everyone, then walked directly toward the restoration platform. "Lena, good morning. I reviewed yesterday's inspection report. I wondered if something had gone wrong." Instead, he smiled. "Excellent work." "Thank you. I've decided something." He turned toward the rest of the committee. "From now on, any restoration decisions go directly through Lena. If she recommends a change, treat it as my approval unless I say otherwise." A few people nodded immediately. One committee member asked, "Even budget adjustments?" Mr. Ashcroft didn't hesitate. "If they're restoration-related, yes." I looked at him. "That's a lot of trust. You've earned it." Those words stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. No conditions, no hidden expectations. Just trust based on the work I had done. Later, while reviewing the updated schedule, Elliot stopped beside me. "My grandfather doesn't hand out confidence easily." I noticed. "He really believes in you." I smiled. "I won't let him down." "I don't think that's possible." For once, I believed him. The following weeks passed quickly. The restored sections began catching sunlight again, filling the cathedral with colors no one had seen in decades. Workers would sometimes stop what they were doing just to look up. Even the wedding planners occasionally applauded when another section was uncovered. Watching people's reactions reminded me why I'd chosen this career in the first place. Near the end of another long day, I returned to my studio to organize notes for the following week's work. The building was unusually quiet. I unlocked the front door and immediately noticed someone standing inside near the display shelves. She turned as soon as she heard me. "Vanessa." She looked almost guilty for being there. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. "The door was open, and I wanted to see where you actually work." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Because in all these years, my sister had never once stepped inside my studio. Vanessa stood near one of the work tables, slowly looking around the studio as if she had walked into a place she hadn't expected to exist. "I really did leave the door unlocked," I said with a small laugh. She looked embarrassed. I almost turned around. "You don't have to." I set my bag on the counter and waited. She didn't seem ready to speak yet. Instead, she wandered toward a display holding restored stained glass panels. Sunlight coming through the front windows painted soft colors across the floor. "You fix these?" she asked. "Most of them." She leaned closer. "I thought you mainly repaired church windows." "I do. But museums, historic homes, libraries, anything with stained glass?" She nodded quietly. I didn't know that. There wasn't any sarcasm in her voice, just honesty. I grabbed 2 bottles of water from the small refrigerator in the corner. "Want one?" "Sure." She accepted it with an awkward smile. For a while, we simply looked around the studio together. It felt strange, not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Finally, she broke the silence. "How long have you been here?" "Almost 12 years." 12? I nodded. "I started with 1 rented room." The workshop grew a little every few years. She looked around again. I never visited. No. You never invited me. I smiled gently. You never asked. She lowered her eyes. Fair. That answer seemed to stay with her. She walked over to a wall covered with framed photographs. There were restoration projects from different cities, newspaper clippings, certificates, group pictures with apprentices and preservation teams. She studied every frame. I've never seen any of this. I didn't think anyone in the family wanted to. She looked at me. Maybe. I never really thought about what you actually did. I appreciated that she didn't make excuses. She wasn't pretending everything had been a misunderstanding. She simply admitted she hadn't paid attention. You always left family dinners early, she said. I usually had work the next morning. I thought you just didn't like coming. I didn't like feeling invisible. She didn't answer. A few moments later, she pointed toward a large drawing spread across my drafting table. Is this the cathedral? It is. She stepped closer. So every colored section has been mapped, photographed, and documented. Her eyes widened. That's a lot more complicated than I imagined. It takes patience. I guess that's why Elliot kept saying your work couldn't be replaced. I smiled. He gives me more credit than I deserve. No. She shook her head. I don't think he does. That surprised me. For years, Vanessa had laughed along whenever someone in the family joked about my career. Now she was defending it. She looked around one last time before speaking again. I feel like I'm meeting my sister for the first time. I didn't know what to say, because part of me felt exactly the same. She had always been the center of every family celebration. I'd always been somewhere around the edges. Neither of us had really crossed that distance. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and sighed. Wedding planner. I smiled. You should answer. She declined the call instead. They can wait another minute. That tiny decision meant more than she probably realized. Before leaving, she paused at the door. Lena? Yeah? I'm sorry. The words were quiet, not dramatic, not polished, just sincere. I should have asked about your life a long time ago. I gave her a small smile. You can start now. She smiled back before walking outside. I watched through the window as she got into her car. For the first time in years, I felt like we had spoken as sisters instead of competitors. I was still standing there when another vehicle pulled into the parking lot. A white van with the logo of a national television network rolled to a stop. 3 people climbed out carrying cameras, lighting equipment, and microphone cases. One of them looked toward my studio, checked something on a clipboard, and started walking straight to my front door. The woman leading the crew smiled as soon as I opened the door. Lena Carter? That's me. Hi, I'm Rebecca. We spoke briefly on the phone last week. Now I remembered. The foundation had mentioned that a national television network wanted to produce a documentary about the cathedral's restoration, but everything had happened so quickly that I hadn't thought much about it. Rebecca extended her hand. We're excited to finally meet you. So am I admitted. Her crew began unloading equipment while she looked around my studio. This is where the planning happens? Most of it. The restoration itself is done at the cathedral. She slowly nodded. I can already tell viewers are going to love seeing this. I laughed nervously. I hope they're more interested in the windows than in me. They'll be interested in both. That answer made me a little uncomfortable. I had spent most of my career trying to keep the focus on the artwork, not the person restoring it. Rebecca seemed to notice. Don't worry, she said. This isn't a celebrity feature. So what is it? A story about preserving history and the people who dedicate their lives to doing it. That sounded much better. For the next hour, they filmed my workbench, sketches, restoration journals, and a few simple shots of me explaining how damaged glass was cataloged before repairs began. Nothing felt forced. Rebecca asked thoughtful questions instead of trying to create dramatic moments. What first drew you to stained glass conservation? My mentor. What kept you doing it? The feeling that history deserves another generation. She smiled. That's exactly the kind of answer I hoped for. Later that afternoon, we moved to the cathedral. The production crew carefully coordinated with the foundation so they wouldn't interrupt the restoration schedule. Several workers who had barely spoken to me before suddenly became curious. You've got TV people following you now? One of them joked. They're following the cathedral. He grinned. Sure they are. Even Mr. Ashcroft stopped to greet the crew. I'm glad you're documenting this, he told Rebecca. Projects like this are rarely seen by the public. We think people will appreciate seeing how much work goes into preserving places like this. So do I. As cameras rolled, I forgot they were even there. Once I climbed onto the restoration platform, everything else faded away. I explained techniques, demonstrated repairs, and answered questions exactly as I would for an apprentice. When filming paused, Rebecca approached me with a clipboard. There's one more thing. What is it? We've been reviewing the cathedral schedule. I nodded. We realized your restoration and the wedding happen almost back to back. They do. Actually, she checked her notes. Some of the wedding preparations will already be underway while we're still filming. I hadn't really thought about that. So the documentary will include both? Only as background, she smiled. The contrast is beautiful. First, the restoration, then people celebrating beneath it. It made sense. The entire purpose of restoring a historic building was so people could continue making memories inside it. I like that, I said. So do we. Before leaving, Rebecca added one last detail. We'll also be filming on the wedding day. I blinked. The wedding itself? Not the ceremony. She laughed. We're producing a restoration documentary, not a wedding special. So what will you film? The completed cathedral. She pointed toward the restored dome overhead. We want the audience to see it filled with light, and with people finally enjoying it. I nodded. That sounds fair. Everything about the project still felt professional, respectful, exactly the way it should be. I had no reason to think it would become anything else. 2 evenings later, while reviewing the latest filming schedule at the cathedral office, I walked past a partially open conference room. Inside, I recognized my mother. She wasn't supposed to be there. She sat across from 2 members of the wedding planning team, speaking quietly enough that I couldn't hear the words. But I did catch one sentence just before the door closed. We need to make sure the cameras stay focused on the wedding. I kept walking. For a second, I thought about opening the conference room door and asking my mother what she was doing there. Instead, I reminded myself of something I'd learned during the restoration. Not every crack needs immediate attention. Sometimes you observe first. The next week became increasingly busy. Construction crews removed the last sections of scaffolding while florists, lighting designers, and wedding coordinators gradually took over the cathedral. The building transformed a little every day. One side still belonged to restoration. The other was becoming a wedding venue. I spent most of my time reviewing the final conservation reports with the foundation. Everything was on schedule. Everything except the strange feeling that someone kept moving things around behind the scenes. It started with a simple question. One of the television assistants walked over carrying a printed schedule. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you know where we can find the lead conservator during the reception setup?" "I'll be here." She frowned. "That's odd." She looked down at her papers. "This version says the restoration team won't be available that day." I blinked. "That's not correct." She made a note on her clipboard. "I'll double-check with production." I didn't think much of it until later that afternoon. Mr. Ashcroft asked me to review the event program prepared for wedding guests. Most of it listed the ceremony timeline, musical performances, and a short paragraph about the cathedral's history. I noticed something missing: the restoration acknowledgement. Originally, the foundation planned to include a brief thank you to the conservation team. Now the paragraph simply read, "The cathedral recently completed an extensive restoration made possible through the Ashcroft Heritage Foundation." Nothing else. No team. No conservators. No names. I walked to the foundation office. "Was this updated?" The coordinator looked surprised. "It was." "Who requested the change?" She hesitated. "The wedding planning committee." "Why?" "They said the wedding program should focus on the couple." I nodded slowly. "I understand." And honestly, that wasn't entirely unreasonable. It was their wedding. I wasn't looking for recognition in the program. But as the week continued, similar changes kept appearing. The backstage access list no longer included my name. The media schedule labeled me only as restoration staff. One production document even replaced lead conservator with technical consultant. Each change seemed small on its own. Together, they painted a different picture. Someone wasn't trying to erase the restoration. Someone was trying to erase the person behind it. Rebecca from the television crew found me reviewing final inspection notes. "You've got a minute?" "Sure." She looked confused. "We've received 3 different versions of your interview schedule." "I've only approved one." I figured. She held up the paperwork. "One version has you speaking after the restoration reveal. The second, no interview. And the third?" She laughed in disbelief. "It says we'll interview an unnamed representative from the foundation instead." I couldn't help smiling. "Sounds complicated." "You don't seem upset." "I've spent most of my life watching people decide who I should be." Rebecca studied me for a moment. "So what do you want?" The answer came more easily than I expected. "I want to finish my work. And after that, if someone asks what I do," I shrugged. "I'll answer honestly." She smiled. "Good. I'm not asking for attention. I know. I'm just not hiding anymore." Rebecca closed her clipboard. "I had a feeling you'd say that." That evening, I drove home with the windows down, letting the cool air clear my head. I couldn't control what my mother put on a guest list. I couldn't control what title appeared on a printed schedule. I couldn't control who tried to rewrite my role. But I could control one thing. If anyone looked me in the eye and asked who restored the cathedral, I wasn't going to let someone else answer for me. Lena's words stayed with me long after I left the planning meeting. I wasn't going to chase recognition anymore. I had spent too many years hoping people would finally notice my work. This time, I wanted something simpler. I would finish the restoration the best way I knew how. If someone asked what I did, I'd answer honestly. If no one asked, I wouldn't force the conversation. That decision gave me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The cathedral was almost ready. Most of the scaffolding had been removed, letting sunlight pour through the restored stained glass windows. Every morning, our team walked through the building with clipboards, checking tiny details before the final inspection. One of the younger conservators smiled as we looked over a repaired stone arch. "I still can't believe we pulled this off." "We all did," I said. "Everyone here deserves credit." He laughed. "You always say that." "Because it's true." Working beside this team reminded me why I'd chosen this career in the first place. Nobody cared where I came from. Nobody asked how expensive my clothes were or what neighborhood I lived in. They only cared whether the work would last another 100 years. That was enough for me. A few days later, the wedding planners arrived again with decorators, photographers, and security staff. Vanessa came with Elliot, looking exhausted from months of preparation. She hesitated before walking over. "Can we talk?" I nodded. She glanced around to make sure Mom wasn't nearby. "I've been thinking about everything." I waited. "I honestly didn't know how Mom treated you all these years." I gave a small smile. "You were busy living your own life." "That's not an excuse." She looked down at the cathedral floor. "I should have noticed." There was genuine regret in her voice. "I'm sorry, Lena." For a second, neither of us spoke. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "I don't expect everything to be fixed overnight." "It won't be." But it's a start. She smiled weakly. I'd like that. Before leaving, she looked around the cathedral with quiet admiration. I never realized how much work goes into restoring a place like this. I laughed. Most people don't. I'm proud of you. The words surprised me more than I expected. For years, I'd imagined hearing something like that from my family. Now, coming from Vanessa, it actually meant something. As she walked away, Elliot stayed behind. I've never seen her question your mother before. Neither have I. I think she's finally seeing things clearly. Maybe. I hope it's not too late. I hope so too. That afternoon, the television crew returned to film more footage for the documentary. They interviewed architects, historians, craftsmen, and members of the foundation. Nobody asked me for an interview, not because they didn't want to, simply because today's schedule focused on construction updates. I didn't mind. There would be plenty of time later if they needed me. As the cameras packed up, I noticed my mother standing near the entrance. She wasn't looking at me. She was watching the television producer. The expression on her face immediately caught my attention. She waited until he stepped away from the crew before approaching him with an overly polite smile. I couldn't hear what she said from where I stood. The producer listened for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully while she continued talking. She pointed discreetly toward the wedding seating charts, then toward the cathedral entrance. When she finally walked away, she looked strangely relieved. The producer pulled out his phone and began making notes. I had no idea what she'd just told him, but something about the exchange didn't feel accidental. The morning of the wedding arrived faster than I expected. For the first time in months, I wasn't carrying a toolbox or reviewing restoration reports. I stood in front of my closet staring at a simple navy dress I'd bought years ago for gallery events. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to attract attention. Exactly what I wanted. As I drove toward the cathedral, I reminded myself of the promise I'd made. I wasn't there to prove anything. I wasn't there to expose anyone. I was there because my sister was getting married. Whatever had happened between my mother and me didn't erase the fact that Vanessa deserved to have a beautiful wedding. When I stepped out of my car, the cathedral looked breathtaking. Morning sunlight poured across the restored stone facade, making every carved detail stand out. Fresh flowers lined the entrance, and guests were already gathering on the wide staircase. For a moment, I simply stood there. A year ago, many of those walls had been cracked, stained, and covered with scaffolding. Now they looked as if they'd never been damaged at all. One of the restoration crew spotted me. "You clean up pretty well, boss." I laughed. "So do you." He straightened his tie. "Feels strange seeing this place without dust everywhere." I was just thinking the same thing. Several members of the foundation greeted me as I walked inside. "Good morning, Lena. Everything looks incredible. You should be proud." "Thank you," I replied. "But everyone earned this." The foundation's chairperson joined us a few moments later. "You've been saying that since the first day." "Because it's true." He smiled. "Still, none of this would have happened without your leadership." Before I could answer, one of the television producers approached us carrying a microphone and headset. "There you are." He looked relieved. "I've been trying to find you." "Me?" "Yes." He smiled politely. "We're filming the final segment of the documentary today." I nodded. "Congratulations. We'd actually like to interview you before the ceremony starts." I blinked. "Oh, I didn't realize that was part of today's schedule." "We kept it flexible in case you were busy." He checked his notes. "The documentary follows the restoration from beginning to end. It only feels complete if the lead conservator shares her perspective." I hesitated. I don't really enjoy being on camera. "You don't have to give a long interview. Just tell us what restoring this cathedral has meant to you." The foundation chair looked at me. "I think people should hear your story." I smiled politely. "If there's time before the ceremony, I'd be happy to help." "Perfect." The producer turned toward one of his assistants. "Let's prepare camera 2 near the west entrance." As they walked away, I noticed someone standing across the hall. My mother. She had been watching the entire conversation. Even from a distance, I recognized the panic on her face. She immediately started weaving through the crowd. Her smile stayed perfectly pleasant until she reached me. "There you are, sweetheart." Her voice sounded warm enough for anyone nearby to believe everything was fine. She gently took hold of my arm. "I need your help with something." I frowned. "Right now?" "It'll only take a minute. The producer is expecting me." "It can wait." She squeezed my arm just a little tighter. "It's about your sister." I glanced toward the television crew. They were busy setting up equipment and hadn't noticed us. "Come with me." Without waiting for my answer, my mother guided me away from the guests, through a side corridor, and toward the back of the reception hall, where no one else seemed to be watching. My mother didn't stop until we reached a quiet hallway behind the reception hall. The music from the ceremony space became muffled, replaced by the soft hum of the air conditioning. She finally let go of my arm. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I looked at her. "What did you want to talk about?" She took a slow breath. "The television crew. What about them?" "I don't want you doing that interview." "I already told them I'd help if there was time." "I know." She rubbed her hands together, something she only did when she was nervous. "Please don't." The word surprised me, not because she had asked, because she had said please. I stayed quiet. "If this is about my job again, it is." She closed her eyes for a moment. "I've spent months making sure Elliot's family believed everything was perfect." I frowned. "They already know what I do. They know enough. They don't know how visible you're about to become." I didn't interrupt. "If that documentary airs," she continued, "people will know you're the woman behind this restoration. They'll start asking questions. They'll realize I lied. So, that's what this is about." She looked away. "I was trying to protect this family." "By hiding me? I thought I was helping." The words came out much softer than I had ever heard from her. "When you started restoring old buildings, I kept thinking people would laugh." "Why?" "Because that's what happened to my father." I blinked. She had never talked about her childhood in detail. "He repaired churches and historic buildings for almost nothing," she said quietly. "People respected his work, but they looked down on him. They invited lawyers and business owners to dinner. Never the craftsmen." She swallowed. I promised myself I'd never live like that. I could hear years of fear in her voice. "So when you chose this career," I thought history was repeating itself. I let the silence settle between us. "You never even asked if I was happy." "I know. You just decided my life would embarrass you." A tear rolled down her cheek before she wiped it away. "I convinced myself that if people admired Vanessa's life, then our family would finally belong." "And what about mine?" She didn't answer immediately. Finally, she whispered, "I told myself you'd forgive me someday." I laughed once, not because anything was funny, because I didn't know what else to do. "Do you know how many opportunities disappeared because someone answered emails pretending to be me?" She lowered her head. "I know." "How many years I believed nobody wanted my work?" "I know." "I almost quit." She covered her face with one hand. "I'm sorry." Those two words carried more weight than every excuse she'd made over the years. I believed she meant them, but they couldn't erase what had happened. "I understand why you were afraid," I said quietly. "I really do." She looked up hopefully. "But understanding isn't the same as pretending none of it happened." She nodded without arguing. "I've spent too many years making myself smaller so everyone else could feel comfortable." I took a slow breath. "I'm done doing that." She stared at me for several long seconds. Then her expression changed. The sadness faded, replaced by the desperate determination I'd seen my entire life. If you do that interview today, her voice trembled. Don't expect me to stay. I frowned. What do you mean? If those cameras turn toward you. She looked straight into my eyes. I'll leave the wedding before they can film me beside you. My mother's words lingered in the hallway long after she stopped speaking. If those cameras turn toward you, I'll leave. She wasn't yelling anymore. She wasn't insulting my work. She simply sounded terrified. I looked at her for a long moment. I don't want you to leave your daughter's wedding. I don't either. Then don't. Her eyes filled with tears again. It's not that simple. No, I said gently. It never was. Neither of us moved. For the first time in years, we weren't arguing. We were just two people standing in front of a problem that had been growing for decades. Finally, I spoke. I'm not doing the interview to embarrass you. I know. I'm not trying to steal Vanessa's wedding. I know. I just don't want to hide anymore. She closed her eyes. I understand. The words were barely audible. But I don't know how to live with the consequences. I nodded. I can't make that choice for you. She looked at me as though she wanted to say something else, but no words came. Instead, she quietly walked away. I watched her disappear around the corner before letting out a slow breath. For a moment, I considered following her. Maybe I could tell the producer I had changed my mind. Maybe skipping one interview would keep the peace. Maybe. Lena? I turned around. My father was standing near the side entrance. I figured I'd find you back here. I smiled faintly. Did you hear everything? Enough. He stepped beside me. Your mother loves both of you. I know. She just spent too many years believing respect comes from appearances. I know that too. He looked toward the cathedral where guests were beginning to take their seats. When I first met your mother, she used to apologize for everything. I looked at him, surprised. Everything? If my shirt wasn't expensive enough. If our apartment was too small. If we couldn't afford vacations. He smiled sadly. She thought people measured a person's worth by what they could show the world. And now? Now she's afraid the world will discover she was wrong. We stood in silence. You don't have to punish her today, he continued. I'm not trying to. I know. He placed a hand on my shoulder. But you don't have to disappear for her either. That sentence settled something inside me. For years I'd been choosing between keeping peace and being honest, as if those were the only two options. Dad smiled. You restored an entire cathedral without changing what made it special. I laughed softly. I never thought of it that way. So don't change yourself now. A volunteer hurried into the hallway. There you are. She looked relieved. The television crew has everything ready whenever you are. I thanked her. She hurried back toward the main hall. Dad glanced at me. You already know your answer. I think I do. He gave my shoulder one gentle squeeze. I'm proud of you. Those words meant more than he probably realized. He walked toward the ceremony, leaving me alone in the quiet hallway. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had spent months repairing broken stone, cleaning centuries-old paintings, and restoring details most visitors would never notice. They had built my career, not my family name, not my mother's approval. Mine. I straightened my dress, took one slow breath, and wiped away the last trace of uncertainty. Whatever happened after today, I wasn't going to lie about who I was. I stepped out of the hallway. The producer noticed me immediately and smiled. There she is. One of the camera operators adjusted the lens. A sound technician clipped a microphone onto his shirt. Every conversation around me seemed to fade into the background. Without looking back, I walked straight toward the waiting cameras. The producer smiled as I walked over. Thanks for making time for us. I'm glad to help. One of the crew members clipped a microphone onto my dress while another adjusted the camera angle to frame the cathedral behind me. Around us, guests continued finding their seats, barely paying attention. The producer explained the plan. "We'll keep it simple. A few questions about the restoration, then we'll film some walking shots inside the cathedral." "Sounds good." He looked toward the camera operator. "Ready?" A thumbs up came from behind the lens. "Rolling." The red recording light came on. The producer smiled at me. "Whenever you're ready, could you introduce yourself?" For a split second, I felt my heart racing. Not because I was afraid of speaking, because this was the first time in years I wasn't hiding behind my work. I smiled at the camera. "My name is Lena Carter. I'm an architectural conservator, and I had the privilege of leading the restoration of this cathedral." The words came out calmly, naturally. No apology, no hesitation. The producer nodded encouragingly. "What did this project mean to you?" I glanced toward the cathedral. When people visit a place like this, they usually admire the stained glass, the stone carvings, or the paintings. They don't always think about how fragile those things are. My job isn't to make history look new. It's to preserve what already matters so future generations can experience it the way we do today. The producer smiled. "That's beautifully said. I've been fortunate to work with an incredible team. Every artisan, engineer, historian, and conservator here deserves recognition. I may have led the project, but this restoration belongs to all of us." Several members of my team standing nearby exchanged smiles. One even gave me a discreet thumbs up. The producer continued. "Were there any moments when you thought the project might not succeed?" I laughed softly. "Several. Historic buildings always surprise you. You solve one problem and discover 3 more underneath. But that's part of the work. You don't rush history. You respect it." As we talked, I began noticing people slowing down nearby. Guests who had been chatting quietly were now listening. Some recognized my name. Others simply looked curious. I heard someone whisper, "She's the project leader?" I thought she worked for the maintenance crew. "No, she's the conservator." The producer asked one final question. "What do you hope people remember after today?" I looked at the restored cathedral one more time. I hope they remember the building. If they leave inspired by its history instead of thinking about the people who restored it, I'll consider that a success. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the producer smiled broadly. "That was perfect." He turned toward the camera. "Keep rolling." The camera operator slowly widened the shot, revealing the cathedral behind me. The producer stepped slightly to one side before addressing the audience watching the documentary. "Today, we're standing inside one of the country's most significant restoration projects." He gestured toward me. "The remarkable transformation you're seeing was led by architectural conservator Lena Carter and her team after months of painstaking work." His voice carried farther than I expected. Nearby conversations stopped almost instantly. More guests turned around. Several members of Elliot's family looked directly at me with obvious surprise. I saw Foundation members smiling proudly. Some of the wedding planners exchanged confused looks, as though trying to remember whether they'd met me before. Even members of the television crew seemed pleased that people were finally connecting the restoration with the person behind it. No one applauded. No dramatic gasps, just dozens of people quietly realizing they had completely misunderstood who I was. I stayed exactly where I was, hands folded calmly in front of me, waiting for the next instruction. Without looking toward the guest seating, I could still feel my family's eyes on me. I just didn't know what their expressions looked like yet. The producer lowered his microphone and smiled. "That's a wrap." One of the camera operators gave him a thumbs up. "We got everything." Another crew member looked at me. "Thank you, Lena. That was exactly what we hoped for." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I'm glad I could help. The producer extended his hand. Congratulations. Not just on the documentary, but on an extraordinary restoration. Thank you. As he stepped away, the foundation's chairperson walked over. I've watched a lot of project leaders over the years. He smiled warmly. You gave credit to everyone except yourself. I laughed. Because they earned it. So did you. Before I could answer, someone started clapping. I turned. One member of the restoration team had begun applauding, then another joined. Within seconds, the entire project team was clapping. Several historians and architects followed, then members of the foundation. The applause spread through the cathedral much faster than I expected. Wedding guests who had overheard the interview joined in, even if they had only learned my name a few minutes earlier. I felt my face grow warm. I wasn't embarrassed, just overwhelmed. I gave a small shake of my head. You really don't have to do this. One of my teammates laughed. Too late. You've been hiding behind scaffolding for months. Let us celebrate you for 30 seconds. Everyone laughed. The applause slowly faded into cheerful conversation. The producer looked pleased. I don't think we could have planned a better ending. Neither could I. I glanced toward the front rows where Elliot was standing beside Vanessa. He caught my eye first. Instead of looking surprised, he simply smiled and nodded, as if everything finally made sense. Members of his family were talking quietly among themselves. Some looked impressed. Others looked curious. None of them seemed bothered by what I'd said. The only person I couldn't find was my mother. I looked around the cathedral. Near the side entrance, I finally saw her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She stood completely still for a moment, watching everyone congratulate me. Then she looked down. Without speaking to anyone, she picked up her handbag. She quietly slipped through the side door. No announcement, no dramatic scene. She simply walked away. Dad noticed a few seconds later. He looked toward the open doorway, then back at me. Our eyes met across the room. He gave me a small, reassuring nod before following after her. I hoped he would. She shouldn't have been alone. I didn't feel victorious watching her leave, only sad. For years, I'd imagined this moment differently. I thought proving myself would somehow erase all the hurt. It didn't. Success couldn't give us back the years we'd lost. The producer called out one last time. We'll send you a copy once the documentary airs. I'd appreciate that. As the television crew packed their equipment, guests slowly returned to wedding conversations. The ceremony was about to begin. Life moved on. I had just turned toward the seating area when I heard footsteps approaching. Lena. I looked up. Vanessa was walking toward me. She had tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. I barely had time to step away from the interview before someone called my name again. Lena. I turned and saw Vanessa standing a few feet away. She looked nervous, almost like she wanted to leave before I answered. For a second, neither of us spoke. The noise of the reception faded into the background while guests laughed, glasses clinked together, and the television crew packed up their equipment nearby. She let out a slow breath. I don't even know where to start. I gave a small shrug. You don't have to force it. No, I do. Her voice cracked just enough for me to notice. I've been thinking about everything these past few weeks. She looked down at her hands. I kept telling myself Mom knew best. Every time she introduced you as just another worker, every time she said your career wasn't important, I believed her. She laughed bitterly. I never asked what you actually did. I stayed quiet. I never visited your studio. I never cared enough to learn. She finally looked at me. I'm sorry. There wasn't a dramatic apology. No tears. No speech that magically erased years of distance. Just one honest sentence. I'm sorry for treating you like someone who was always supposed to stand behind everyone else. For the first time in years, I believed she meant it. I was angry. I admitted. I know. I missed so many opportunities because of what happened. She nodded slowly. I found out. Her eyes became watery. When Dad showed me those old emails, I couldn't sleep. Neither could I. She took one careful step closer. I don't expect you to forgive us today. I don't want us to stay strangers. That sentence hit harder than I expected. Because she was right. Somehow, despite growing up in the same house, we'd become strangers a long time ago. I smiled a little. We'll have to start small. She smiled too. I'd like that. Without another word, she wrapped me in a careful hug. It felt awkward. It also felt real. When she stepped back, someone else was waiting. Dad. He had been standing nearby the entire time, giving us space. He walked over slowly with his hands in his pockets. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something practical, something simple like he always did. Instead, he looked at me with eyes I had never seen before. You did good. That was all. 3 words, but they carried everything he had never managed to say. I laughed softly. That's it? He smiled. You know I was never very good with speeches. I know. He cleared his throat. When you were little, you'd spend hours fixing broken picture frames in the garage. I laughed. I usually made them worse. Sometimes. He chuckled. But you never gave up. He looked toward the restored building behind us. You still don't. For the first time in my life, I saw pride written plainly across my father's face. Not hidden. Not implied. Just there. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me something. It was an old photograph. Me. Covered in paint at 12 years old, holding a tiny wooden ornament I'd carved. I've carried this for years. You kept it? Of course. His voice became quiet. I always knew you were building something bigger than the rest of us could see. I hugged him before I could stop myself. He hugged me back. Long enough for years of silence to lose a little of their weight. If you're still enjoying the story so far, I said with a small laugh, looking toward one of the documentary cameras that was still recording background footage. Don't forget to like the video and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know. The producer overheard me and laughed. That sounded natural. I've been told I should practice talking on camera. You'll get another chance. What do you mean? He handed me one of his business cards. The documentary isn't just staying local anymore. I frowned. What are you talking about? Our network approved national distribution this afternoon. I stared at him. The entire restoration story. The interviews. Your work. They'll all air nationwide. For a second, I couldn't find any words. Everything I'd spent years hiding without even realizing it would soon be seen by millions of people. I looked back at the restored building glowing under the evening lights. It no longer felt like proof of what I'd lost. It felt like proof of who I'd become. I had no idea how much life was about to change, but several months later, people would begin recognizing my name in places I'd never even visited, and nothing would ever feel ordinary again. A few months passed faster than I expected. The documentary aired nationwide on a Sunday evening. I almost didn't watch it. I stayed at the studio finishing paperwork while my phone kept buzzing. When I finally checked it, there were dozens of missed calls and emails. Architects, museum directors, historic preservation groups. People I'd never met wanted me to restore their buildings. By the end of the week, my schedule was completely full. The studio that had once struggled to survive suddenly had more work than I could handle. I hired 2 assistants, then a project coordinator. Before long, we moved into a larger workspace. Sometimes I'd stand in the middle of the shop, listening to my team discussing drawings and restoration plans, and quietly smile. Not because I had become well known, because I finally got to spend every day doing the work I loved. Dad started visiting every couple of weeks. He'd show up with coffee, walk through the studio, and ask questions about whatever we were restoring. So that's original stone? How old is this wood? He wasn't trying to make up for lost time with speeches, he just kept showing up. And honestly, that meant more than any apology. Vanessa changed too. She started sending me articles about restoration projects and asking what I thought. We even had dinner together without talking about the wedding or everything that had happened. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes conversations still became awkward, but awkward felt a lot better than pretending. Mom was different. She never apologized. At least, not with words. One rainy afternoon, a package arrived at my studio. There was no return address. Inside was my grandmother's old music box. One side was cracked, the finish had faded, and one small brass hinge was bent. A folded note rested underneath. If anyone can save this, you can. No signature. None was needed. I recognized Mom's handwriting immediately. I sat there smiling for a long time. Nothing between us had magically healed. There were still years we couldn't get back. But for the first time, she trusted my hands instead of being ashamed of what they represented. That was enough. I restored the music box carefully and mailed it back. No letter, no explanation, just the repaired music box. Life kept moving. New projects arrived. Historic buildings found new life. People often recognized me from the documentary, but I never thought of that as my greatest achievement. The documentary introduced me once. My work kept introducing me long after the cameras were gone. Looking back, I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. People can introduce you the wrong way. They can misunderstand your value or try to define your place in the world. But if you stay true to what you do, your work will eventually speak louder than anyone else's opinion. If this story connected with you, maybe you've also been underestimated or misunderstood by the people closest to you. Sometimes the best response isn't proving them wrong with words. It's quietly building a life that reflects who you truly are. If you've ever experienced something like this, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you enjoy emotional family dramas like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Thanks for spending your time with me. Until next time, take care.